Hey, stop scrolling for a second. A maid was slapped in front of 200 wedding guests. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just smiled. And that smile made the billionaire's fiancé's blood run cold. Because nobody in that mansion knew who this maid really was. Nobody knew what she was trained to do. And by the end of that night, the woman in the pink silk dress would wish she had never raised her hand. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Tonight's story is one of the most powerful I've ever told. A story about pride, about hidden strength, and about a woman who was underestimated by everyone around her. Until the one night she couldn't be ignored anymore. This is a story about dignity, about justice, and about what happens when the quietest person in the room turns out to be the most dangerous. Let's begin. Nobody at Ashford Manor knew her real name until it was too late. They called her the new girl, or sometimes, when they were feeling generous, Maria. She wore the same lavender uniform every day, the white apron pressed and spotless, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun that never had a single strand out of place. She moved through the mansion's marble hallways like a ghost, quiet, efficient, invisible. Maria Delgado had been working at Ashford Manor for exactly 6 weeks. She polished silver. She folded linens. She carried trays of champagne through rooms filled with people who never once looked her in the eye. To the Ashford family and their glittering circle of friends, she was furniture, a uniform, a pair of hands that made their lives easier and whose own life didn't matter enough to ask about. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that 6 years ago Maria Delgado had been a decorated combat instructor. She had trained soldiers twice her size to fall unconscious in under 4 seconds. She had walked out of situations that would have killed most people twice over. She had a name once, in another world, that made hardened men go quiet in a room. But that life was gone now. Buried. And Maria wanted it to stay buried. She hadn't taken this job by accident, though. Ashford Manor belonged to Daniel Ashford, heir to one of the largest real estate fortunes on the East Coast. A man who had inherited his father's company at 26 and somehow, against every expectation of the vultures circling him, kept it standing. Daniel didn't know Maria. He barely knew any of the household staff by name. But Maria knew him. She had known his mother, Eleanor Ashford, years ago, long before Eleanor passed away from cancer 3 years back. And it was a promise made to a dying woman that had brought Maria here, into a house full of strangers, wearing a uniform that made her invisible. "Watch over my son," Eleanor had whispered from her hospital bed, her hand trembling in Maria's. "He doesn't see people clearly. He never learned how. Please. Just watch." Maria had made that promise not knowing what it would cost her. Pride. Comfort. 6 weeks of being talked over, stepped around, treated like she didn't exist. And especially not knowing about Vanessa Cole. Vanessa was Daniel's fiancée, a woman with a smile made for magazine covers and eyes that calculated the value of everything and everyone she looked at. She had swept into Daniel's life 8 months ago, dazzling him with charm so polished it looked like sincerity if you didn't look too closely. The staff whispered about her when she wasn't around. The way she snapped her fingers for water. The way she tested new maids by leaving cash out to see if it disappeared. The way her assistant quietly quit every few months, always looking pale and shaken on their way out the door. Maria had watched Vanessa carefully since her first week. Something about the woman didn't sit right. Not just her cruelty, though that alone was enough to notice. It was something colder. Calculated. The way Vanessa's eyes would flick toward Daniel's private study when she thought no one was looking. The way she asked pointed questions about the company's finances during dinner parties, phrased casually like idle curiosity, but timed too precisely to be accidental. Maria said nothing. He poured wine. She refilled bread baskets. She watched. Tonight was the engagement party. 300 guests, string lights strung across the garden, a jazz quartet playing beneath a white tent big enough to fit a small house. Vanessa had planned every detail herself, down to the particular shade of ivory in the table linens. Daniel stood beside her most of the evening in his tailored navy suit, smiling the tired smile of a man who loved being loved but had forgotten how to ask if the love around him was real. Maria moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, her expression carefully neutral, her eyes doing what they always did, watching. Watching Vanessa's hand rest a little too long on the arm of a man who was not Daniel. Watching the way Vanessa's smile dropped the instant Daniel turned his back. She didn't know yet that tonight, all of it, the secrets, the danger, the truth Eleanor Ashford had asked her to protect her son from, was about to come crashing to the surface in front of everyone. It started, as these things often do, over a spilled drop of red wine. The tray tipped for less than a second. Maria had been weaving carefully through a knot of guests near the dessert table when a drunk groomsman stumbled backward into her, hard enough to knock the tray sideways. She caught it. Years of trained reflexes saved every glass but one. A single flute of red wine tipped, and a small splash landed on the hem of Vanessa Cole's ivory gown. It was barely a stain, the size of a coin. But Vanessa turned like she'd been burned. "Are you serious right now?" Her voice cut through the low hum of party chatter, sharp enough that heads nearby began turning. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost?" "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Maria said quietly, already reaching for a napkin. "It was an accident. Let me. Don't touch me." Vanessa yanked her arm back like Maria's hand was something contaminated. Her face had gone the particular shade of red that comes not from embarrassment, but from the thrill of having an audience to perform outrage for. "This is a Valentina couture gown. Custom. Do you people even understand what these things cost? Or do you just not care because it's not yours?" A small crowd had gathered now, the way crowds do at the smell of conflict. Daniel across the tent hadn't noticed yet. He was deep in conversation with an older gentleman near the bar. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward him for a half-second, and something in her expression shifted. Calculating. Performing. "I said I'm sorry," Maria repeated, calm, steady. "It's a small mark. I can have it professionally cleaned tonight. It should come out completely. I don't want your apology. I want you to understand your place." Vanessa's voice rose another notch, theatrical now, playing to the small crowd that had gathered with their phones half-raised, sensing a moment worth capturing. "People like you get hired because you're supposed to know how to not ruin things. This is exactly why my mother told me never to trust the help." Something in the tent went quiet. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone near the back murmured, "That's a little much, isn't it?" Vanessa didn't hear it or didn't care. "You know what," she said, stepping closer, eyes narrowing, voice dropping into something colder, more personal. "I've had enough of this attitude from you people all week. Somebody needs to teach you some respect." And then her hand moved. The slap landed across Maria's cheek with a crack loud enough to silence the string quartet mid-note. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone's champagne glass clinked against a table as they set it down too fast. Even the groomsman who'd caused the spill in the first place stood frozen, mouth open. Maria's head had turned slightly with the force of the blow. For a long moment she didn't move. The tray was still balanced perfectly in her other hand. Not a single glass had shifted. Her breathing hadn't even changed. Slowly, she turned her face back toward Vanessa. And she smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile or a broken one. It was calm, almost amused. The kind of smile that made the hair on the back of your neck rise without you understanding exactly why. "You really shouldn't have done that," Maria said softly. Not a threat. Just a fact, delivered the way you'd warn someone their coffee was too hot. Vanessa blinked, thrown off by the reaction she wasn't expecting. Excuse me. Across the tent, Daniel had finally turned. His conversation died mid-sentence as his eyes landed on the scene. His fiancée, hand still raised, and his quiet, invisible maid standing there with a red mark blooming on her cheek and an expression that didn't match it at all. He started walking toward them, weaving through the crowd, his stomach twisting with a dread he couldn't yet explain. "Vanessa," he called out, voice tight. "What is going on?" But before Vanessa could answer, one of the groomsmen, a heavy-set man named Chase, who'd had one too many whiskeys and fancied himself the hero of the moment, stepped forward and grabbed Maria roughly by the arm. "Hey, you don't smile at Miss Cole like that," he slurred, yanking her toward the tent's edge. "Get out of here before—" He never finished the sentence. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Chase's hand closed around Maria's wrist, dragging her forward with the careless strength of a man who had never once in his life expected resistance from someone he outweighed by 80 pounds. Maria didn't yank away. She didn't struggle. She simply turned her wrist a precise 1/4 inch, a motion so small most of the crowd didn't even register it happened, and Chase's grip broke like it had never been there at all. In the same fluid motion, without spilling a single drop from the tray still balanced effortlessly in her other hand, she stepped into him rather than away, and Chase found himself suddenly, inexplicably, sitting on the grass, blinking up at the string lights above the tent, utterly unable to explain how he had gotten there. The tent went dead silent. Somewhere near the back, someone's phone was already recording. Maria set the champagne tray down gently on the nearest table. Not a rushed movement, not a defensive one, just calm, deliberate, controlled, and turned to face the stunned crowd. The red mark on her cheek was still visible, but her expression hadn't cracked once. "I didn't come here to hurt anyone," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent tent. "I came here to do my job. And I would have kept doing it quietly, the way I have for 6 weeks, if that's all this had stayed." Vanessa had gone pale, one hand still frozen mid-air from the slap she delivered moments before, staring at Maria like she was looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. "Who?" Vanessa's voice came out thin. "Who even are you?" And this was the moment. The one Maria had spent 6 weeks trying to avoid. The one Eleanor Ashford's dying words had set into motion the second Maria accepted this job. Daniel had reached the front of the crowd now. His face a mixture of confusion, alarm, and something else. A dawning recognition, like a puzzle piece sliding into place from a picture he hadn't realized he was looking at. "Wait," he said slowly, staring at Maria. "Delgado. Maria Delgado." He said the name like he was testing it, tasting it, trying to remember where he'd heard it before. And then his eyes widened. You were in my mother's photographs. The ones from her old unit. From before I was born. She used to talk about a Sergeant Delgado who saved her life in. That was my father, Maria said quietly. Sergeant Rafael Delgado. He trained your mother before she left the service. And he trained me the same way, from the time I could walk. She paused, glancing at the crowd still frozen around her. Phone still recording before looking back at Daniel. Your mother asked me to watch over you, Daniel. Before she died. She didn't trust everyone around you. She was right not to. The words landed like a physical blow. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You've been protecting me, he said slowly. For 6 weeks. As a maid. For 6 weeks, Maria confirmed. Because it was the only way to get close enough without anyone asking questions. Without anyone like her. Her eyes flicked briefly, deliberately toward Vanessa, realizing that someone was actually paying attention. Vanessa's face had gone through several colors now, landing somewhere between fury and something that looked distinctly like fear. This is ridiculous, she snapped, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. She's clearly unstable, Daniel. She just assaulted your groomsman in front of everyone. He grabbed her first, a voice interrupted. It was one of the older caterers, a woman named Ruth who had worked Ashford events for a decade and had watched the entire thing unfold from 20 feet away. I saw the whole thing. He grabbed her arm after you slapped her for spilling one drop of wine. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Several phones, Maria realized, had captured all of it. The slap, Chase's grab, and everything after. Daniel turned slowly to face his fiancée. Something in his expression shifting into a stillness that was far more dangerous than shouting would have been. "You hit a member of my household staff," he said quietly, "in front of 300 people, over a drop of wine." "Daniel, she ruined my dress." "That's not what I asked." His voice had dropped, cold now, controlled. "And now I'm wondering what else you've done that I haven't seen." Vanessa's face flickered. Just for a moment, so fast most people would have missed it. But Maria didn't miss it. She had spent 6 weeks reading exactly this kind of flicker. It wasn't guilt. It was calculation. The look of someone realizing the ground beneath them had just shifted, and recalculating how to land on their feet anyway. "I think," Maria said slowly, looking directly at Vanessa now, "there's something you should know, Daniel. Something I've been watching for 6 weeks, waiting for the right moment to bring to you privately. But I don't think privately is an option anymore." The tent had gone utterly silent. Even the jazz quartet had stopped pretending to play. "What are you talking about?" Daniel asked. Maria took a slow breath. 3 weeks ago," she said, "I found paperwork in Vanessa's study. Paperwork with your company's letterhead. Paperwork about a life insurance policy. One that names her as the sole beneficiary, filed 2 weeks before your engagement was even announced." For a long moment, nobody in the tent moved. Daniel's face drained of color so completely that for a second, Maria worried he might actually lose his footing. That's not possible," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "I never signed a life insurance policy naming Vanessa as—" "You didn't," Maria said gently. "I checked. Your signature on that document is forged. Badly, actually. Whoever did it clearly had access to sample signatures but never learned to properly replicate the pressure pattern of your handwriting. It's the kind of forgery that would fool a casual glance, but not a forensic one." Vanessa's composure, which had been cracking steadily since the slap, finally shattered completely. "You went through my private study. That's illegal. You can't just—" "I clean this house, Vanessa," Maria said evenly. "I have access to every room in it. And I've had a great deal of practice noticing things that don't belong." She turned back to Daniel. "There's more. The policy is for $18 million. It was filed through a private underwriter, not the family's usual insurance firm, but a smaller company registered less than a year ago. I looked into it. That company shares a registered agent with a firm connected to a man named Marcus Weller." Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. "Weller. That's— Vanessa, that's the man you introduced me to at the golf club. Your old family friend." "He's not a family friend," Maria said quietly. "He's a private consultant who specializes in, and I want to be careful how I phrase this in front of everyone, in helping people quietly acquire assets from estates that experience unexpected losses. He's been investigated twice. Never charged. Both times, the people around him experienced convenient misfortunes shortly before the investigations began." Someone in the crowd audibly gasped. Vanessa's face had gone from pale to a strange blotchy red. Her hands trembling now, no longer with anger but with something closer to panic. "This is insane," she said, but her voice had lost all its earlier bite. You're making this up. This is some kind of jealous fantasy, some obsession you have with Daniel, and you're using my dress, my ruined dress, as an excuse to—" "I have copies," Maria interrupted, calm and unshaken. "Photographs of the documents, timestamps, everything. I wasn't planning to reveal any of this tonight. I was going to bring it to Daniel privately next week, once I had confirmed everything with a forensic document examiner I trust." But you slapped me in front of 300 witnesses over a wine stain, Vanessa. You made this public. Not me. Daniel took a step back from Vanessa like the ground beneath her had suddenly become unstable. His hands were shaking now, not with sadness but with a particular kind of fury that comes from realizing you nearly married your own murder. $18 million, he said quietly, almost to himself. You were going to. He couldn't even finish the sentence. I never said anything about hurting you, Vanessa said quickly, too quickly, her eyes darting toward the crowd, toward the exits, toward anywhere but Daniel's face. The policy, that's standard for couples getting married, everyone does that. Before the engagement is even announced. Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. Forged, without my knowledge, through Marcus Weller's company. Vanessa, stop. Just stop talking. The tent had become a courtroom now. 300 witnesses standing in stunned silence beneath the string lights, phones raised, capturing every second of the unraveling. Maria stepped back slightly, letting the moment breathe, letting Daniel process what he was hearing. This was never supposed to be about her. It was about protecting the promise she'd made to a dying woman 3 years ago. A promise that had just, in the space of 10 minutes, gone from quiet vigilance to a very public reckoning. But even as she stepped back, Maria's trained eyes caught something the rest of the crowd missed. Marcus Weller himself was standing near the back of the tent. She hadn't noticed him arrive. And the moment his name had been spoken aloud, he had gone very, very still, the stillness of a man deciding in real time whether to run. Maria moved before she consciously decided to. Weller had already turned, weaving quickly through the stunned crowd toward the tent's rear exit. His phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent even from a distance. Maria caught fragments as she closed the gap between them with the unhurried, efficient stride of someone who had chased far more dangerous people than a nervous consultant in an expensive suit. It's blown, get the accounts moved now before. Mr. Weller. Maria's voice was calm, almost pleasant, as she stepped directly into his path near the tent's edge. Leaving so soon. Weller's eyes flicked over her. The maid's uniform, the still reddened cheek, the calm expression. And for a moment he clearly miscalculated who he was dealing with, the way everyone at this party had all evening. Get out of my way, he said, trying to step around her. Maria didn't move. You should probably know, she said conversationally, that Daniel's head of security is already on his way here. I texted him the moment I confirmed the forgery 3 weeks ago, just in case tonight went sideways. He should be arriving in. She glanced past Weller's shoulder toward the driveway, where headlights were indeed sweeping across the gravel. Right about now, actually. Weller's face went slack with a particular horror of a man watching his careful plan collapse in real time. He turned to run the other direction, back into the tent, and found himself facing not just Daniel and the stunned crowd, but 2 uniformed security officers walking briskly toward him, having just arrived through the front gate. Mr. Weller, one of the officers said. We'd like to ask you a few questions about a company registered under Halcyon Trust Partners. The color drained from Weller's face entirely. Behind them, in the center of the tent, Vanessa had sunk into one of the white folding chairs. Her earlier fury completely replaced by something smaller, more desperate. Daniel, please let me explain, this isn't what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, Daniel said. His voice quiet but carrying through the whole tent. You were going to marry me for a payout you engineered before we even got engaged. Everything, the way you looked at me, the way you talked about our future. None of it was real, was it? Vanessa didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence answered for her. Maria watched from a few feet away, her expression unreadable, though something in her chest had loosened slightly, the particular relief of a promise finally, fully kept. Eleanor Ashford had asked her to watch over her son. Tonight, watching had turned into something far more consequential than either of them could have imagined 6 weeks ago. Daniel turned toward her. His eyes red-rimmed but steady, 300 guests still frozen in stunned silence around them. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "Not metaphorically. Actually. If I'd married her, if that policy had gone through and nobody had caught it, I might not have." He couldn't finish the sentence, and he didn't need to. Everyone in the tent understood exactly what he meant. "Your mother asked me to watch over you," Maria said simply. "I made her a promise. I intended to keep it quietly. I'm sorry it happened like this, in front of everyone. Don't apologize." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "Don't you dare apologize. You just—" He gestured helplessly at the chaos around them, at Weller being led toward a security vehicle, at Vanessa sitting alone and exposed in her stained ivory gown. "You just saved everything. My company. My life. Maybe more than that." The security officers were placing Weller into the back of a vehicle now, his protests growing quieter as reality set in. Vanessa remained seated, alone, the crowd around her having instinctively created distance, the way people do around something they've realized was never what it appeared to be. Maria touched the side of her still reddened cheek almost absently, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Relief mostly. And underneath it, something that felt almost like grief, for Daniel, for the version of tonight he'd believed he was walking into, for the future he'd thought was waiting for him and now had to grieve before he could move forward. "What happens now?" someone in the crowd asked quietly. Not to Daniel, not to Maria specifically, just into the stunned silence of the tent, the question every single guest was privately asking themselves. Nobody answered right away. Because nobody, including Maria, fully knew yet. The police arrived 20 minutes later, moving through the wreckage of what had been, only an hour before, the happiest night of Daniel Ashford's life. Vanessa was escorted out quietly, no handcuffs yet, just careful questions and the kind of grim, procedural courtesy officers show people who are about to become the center of a much longer investigation. She didn't look at Daniel as she left. She didn't look at Maria either. Her eyes stayed fixed forward, on some point in the middle distance, as though refusing to see the wreckage of the night made it slightly less real. Weller was already gone, taken separately. His phone confiscated as evidence. Detective Rosa Ibarra, a sharp-eyed woman in a gray blazer who had clearly seen more than her share of financial fraud cases, spent nearly an hour talking with Daniel and Maria in the mansion study, going through the documentation Maria had carefully preserved over the past 3 weeks. "You did everything right," Detective Ibarra said, closing her notebook as the interview wound down. "The way you documented this, time-stamped everything, kept copies in a separate location, that's better evidence collection than half the private investigators I work with. Where'd you learn to do this?" Maria considered how much to say. "My father trained me in a lot of things," she said simply. Attention to detail was one of them. The detective studied her for a moment longer than necessary, the way people do when they sense there's more to a story than what's being offered, before nodding and letting it go. "Well, whatever your background is, Mr. Ashford is a very lucky man tonight. This policy would have made his death look tragically convenient. Car accident, medical mishap, home invasion gone wrong. Weller's operation has 3 prior cases with almost identical patterns. Nobody ever connected the dots until now." After the detective left, the mansion fell into a strange, hollow quiet. The 300 guests had gone home hours ago, whispering to each other in the driveway, already composing the story they'd tell friends tomorrow. The white tent stood empty in the garden, string lights still glowing over abandoned champagne glasses and chairs pushed askew from the chaos. Daniel sat at the long kitchen table, staring at nothing, his tailored jacket discarded over the back of a chair, his tie loosened, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had aged several years in a single evening. Maria stood near the doorway, uncertain, for the first time in 6 weeks, of what her role in this house actually was anymore. The uniform suddenly felt strange against her skin, a costume for a part she no longer needed to play, now that the truth was out. "You don't have to keep standing there like staff," Daniel said quietly without looking up. "Please, sit down." Maria hesitated, then crossed the kitchen and sat across from him. "I don't even know what to say to you," Daniel admitted, finally meeting her eyes. "Thank you it feels impossibly small for what you actually did." "You don't need to say anything," Maria said. "I made a promise to your mother. Kept it. That's enough for me." "Tell me about her," Daniel said suddenly, his voice catching. "Tell me about my mother. The version you knew. I was young when she talked about her old military days. I never really understood any of it. I always thought it was just old stories." And so, in the quiet kitchen at 2 in the morning, surrounded by the wreckage of a party that had revealed far more than anyone intended, Maria told him. About Eleanor Ashford, 23 years old and terrified, on her first deployment overseas. About the ambush that nearly took her life, and the young sergeant, Maria's father, who had pulled her out under fire, carried her nearly a mile to safety on a badly broken ankle, and never once complained about it afterward. About the letters they'd exchanged for years after, long after Eleanor left the service and built the life that eventually led to Daniel. About the day 3 years ago when Eleanor, dying frightened not for herself but for the son she was leaving behind in a world full of people who valued his money more than his heart, had reached out to Maria and asked for one final favor. "She always said you had a good heart," Maria said quietly. "She was worried it would get taken advantage of." She wasn't wrong, apparently. Daniel let out a broken laugh, somewhere between grief and disbelief. "No, she wasn't." They sat together in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable, just full of grief and relief, and the strange, disorienting gratitude of surviving something you never even knew you were in danger of. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked eventually. Now that everyone knows. "You can't exactly go back to being invisible." Maria smiled faintly, tiredly. "I honestly don't know." The days that followed moved strangely, too fast and too slow all at once. News of the engagement party spread quickly, not through official channels but through the guests' phones, the videos they'd captured circulating first among friends, then wider still, until by the following afternoon, Billionaire's Fiancée exposed as fraud, saved by mystery Maid, was trending across half a dozen platforms, viewed by millions of people who had never heard of Daniel Ashford or Ashford Manor before that morning. Maria hated it. The attention felt like a spotlight aimed directly at everything she'd spent years trying to keep quiet and buried. Reporters called the mansion's landline until Daniel had it disconnected. A tabloid published a grainy photo of her from years earlier, from her military days in uniform unsmiling, under a headline that used the word assassin in a way that made her stomach turn. "I'm not what they're saying," she told Daniel one evening, sitting on the back terrace overlooking the gardens, the video of the engagement party still being dissected by strangers online somewhere. "I was an instructor, trainer. I never." She stopped herself, unwilling to finish a sentence about the things she had, in fact, done in a different life, for reasons that had felt necessary at the time and now felt very far away. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," Daniel said. "Least of all me." But it wasn't just the media attention weighing on her. It was something quieter, harder to name. For 6 weeks she had lived in this house as someone invisible, someone whose thoughts and feelings and history didn't matter to anyone around her. That invisibility had been a kind of armor. Painful, yes, but safe. Now that armor was gone, stripped away in front of 300 witnesses and, soon after, several million strangers online. And Maria wasn't entirely sure who she was supposed to be without it. Vanessa's arrest had been formalized 3 days after the party. Conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and pending further investigation, potential charges related to what prosecutors were calling attempted endangerment, given the pattern Weller's operation had shown in prior cases. Vanessa's lawyer was already working the media, framing her as a woman who'd been manipulated by Weller rather than an active participant, but the forged signature and the timeline of the policy told a story that was difficult to spin. Daniel, for his part, had thrown himself into work in the way people do when sitting still means confronting feelings they aren't ready for. He cancelled the wedding vendors one by one, each call a small, necessary grief. He met with lawyers about tightening the company's internal safeguards. He barely slept. It was Maria, in the end, who noticed he wasn't eating properly, who started quietly leaving meals for him even after Detective Ibarra's investigation had wrapped, and there was technically no more reason for her to still be watching over him at all. "You don't have to keep doing this," Daniel told her one night, finding her in the kitchen at 11, wrapping up a plate she'd made for him hours earlier that he'd forgotten to eat. "You've done more than enough. You don't have to keep being my, whatever this is, housekeeper, guardian angel, whatever word fits." "I know I don't have to," Maria said simply. "I'm choosing to." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. Not quite understanding yet, but beginning to. "Why?" he asked quietly. Maria considered the question longer than she expected to need. "Because your mother asked me to watch over you," she said slowly. "That's how it started. But somewhere in these 6 weeks, it stopped being just a promise I was keeping. It became something I wanted to do." She paused, surprised at her own honesty. "I haven't wanted much of anything for a long time. Not since I left that other life behind. But I want this. I want to see you actually okay. Not just recovered. Okay." The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of crickets through the open window. "I don't know how to be okay right now," Daniel admitted. "I don't know how to trust anything I'm feeling. Everything I thought I knew about the last 8 months turned out to be a lie." "Not everything," Maria said quietly. "I wasn't lying to you. Not about anything that mattered." Something in Daniel's expression softened, cracked open just slightly in a way that felt, for the first time since the party, less like grief and more like the beginning of something else entirely. 6 weeks passed. Vanessa's trial date was set for the following spring, the evidence Maria had gathered forming the backbone of a case that prosecutors privately admitted was one of the cleanest fraud cases they'd handled in years. Marcus Weller, facing charges in 3 separate jurisdictions, had begun cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his cooperation was unraveling a network far larger than anyone at the engagement party could have imagined. At least 4 other wealthy families across the country who had unknowingly been targeted by similar schemes, 2 of whom had already lost family members under circumstances that were now being quietly reopened for investigation. Daniel testified before a grand jury, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been in the weeks immediately following the party. Something in him had settled, slowly, the way grief does when it finally has somewhere to go besides just sitting heavy in your chest. Maria had stayed at Ashford Manor the entire time, though not as a maid anymore. That role had quietly, almost without either of them announcing it, dissolved into something else. She helped Daniel review the company's security protocols, drawing on knowledge from a life she'd spent years trying not to think about. She sat beside him during the difficult calls with investigators. She was there, simply there, in the way people are for each other when trust has been so thoroughly broken that its slow rebuilding needs someone patient enough to stay through the whole uncertain process. It was on a quiet Tuesday evening 6 weeks after the party that Daniel finally asked the question he'd been circling for weeks. They were on the back terrace again, the same spot where so many of their late-night conversations had happened since that first chaotic night. The gardens below were dark except for a few solar lights along the pathways, and the late summer air carried the smell of jasmine from the vines climbing the terrace railing. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "And you can tell me it's none of my business, or too soon, or whatever you need to say." "Okay," Maria said. "That life you had before this," Daniel said carefully. "The one you don't talk about. Do you miss it?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful honesty she gave everything. Got people killed in the world I lived in. And now? Daniel asked quietly. Maria looked at him, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself answer honestly, without calculating the risk first. Now I'm not sure I know how to do this, she said. Wanting something. When? It's been a long time since I let myself feel that without immediately trying to shut it down. Daniel's breath caught slightly. And are you feeling it now? The silence between them stretched, charged with everything neither of them had said out loud yet. Weeks of late nights and quiet meals and the particular intimacy that grows between two people who have survived something together. Yes, Maria said simply. Daniel reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. Carefully, like he was asking a question with the gesture itself. Maria didn't pull away. I know this is complicated, Daniel said. I know I'm barely out of the wreckage of an engagement built on a lie. I know it probably doesn't make sense to feel this certain about anything right now. But I do. About this. About you. It doesn't have to make sense right away, Maria said quietly. It just has to be real. It would be easy at this point to say everything simply fell into place, that the story ended the moment Daniel and Maria acknowledged what had been quietly growing between them for months. But real life, even life as dramatic as this, doesn't work that cleanly. There were hard conversations still ahead. Maria had spent years building walls specifically designed to keep people from getting close enough to matter. And those walls didn't come down overnight just because she decided, on one quiet terrace evening, that she wanted them to. There were nights she pulled back without meaning to, old instincts flaring up, reminding her that closeness had costs she wasn't always sure she could afford to pay again. Daniel, for his part, carried his own weight. The particular grief of having built 8 months of his life around someone who never actually existed the way he thought she did. There were mornings he woke up disoriented, momentarily forgetting, reaching for a version of trust that Vanessa had systematically dismantled. Rebuilding that, learning to trust his own instincts again after they'd been so thoroughly proven wrong, took longer than either of them expected. But they did the work. Slowly, deliberately, the way people do when what they're building actually matters to them. Maria eventually told Daniel more about her past than she'd told almost anyone in years. About the mission that had gone wrong 6 years ago, the one that had ultimately driven her out of that life entirely, the guilt she still carried for decisions made in impossible circumstances. Daniel listened without flinching, without trying to fix what didn't need fixing, just present, the way she had been present for him. And Daniel, in turn, opened up about the loneliness of growing up as the heir to something enormous, the friendships he'd never fully trusted, the way people's kindness toward him always seemed to have an angle he was constantly, exhaustingly trying to detect. Vanessa had simply been the most sophisticated version of a pattern he'd lived with his whole life. You never had an angle, he told Maria one evening, months into whatever they had quietly become to each other by then. Even when you were literally hiding your entire identity from me. Somehow that was still the most honest anyone's ever been with me. Vanessa's trial concluded that following spring. She was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, sentenced to 11 years. Her carefully cultivated public image collapsing entirely under the weight of evidence Maria had painstakingly gathered months before anyone else even suspected something was wrong. Marcus Weller received a longer sentence. His cooperation ultimately not sparing him from the consequences of a scheme that investigators eventually connected to 2 prior deaths. Ashford Manor changed in the months that followed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the quiet ways homes change when the people living in them are finally, genuinely happy. Daniel restructured parts of his company's leadership, bringing in people he trusted for reasons that had nothing to do with what they could offer him and everything to do with who they actually were. Maria, for the first time in years, let herself build a life that wasn't defined by watching over someone else's safety at the expense of her own. She started teaching self-defense classes twice a week at a community center a few miles from the mansion. Nothing dramatic, nothing tied to her old life, Just practical skills for people, mostly women, who wanted to feel safer in a world that too often made them feel small. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself years ago, wearing a uniform that had once meant something entirely different. But it was hers, chosen freely, and that made all the difference. 1 year to the day after that chaotic engagement party, Ashford Manor hosted another event under the same white tent, the same string lights strung across the same garden. This time, there was no forgery hidden in a private study. No hidden insurance policy. No consultant slipping quietly toward the exit as his careful plan unraveled. This time, when Maria walked down the aisle between the rows of white chairs, she wasn't wearing a lavender uniform with a pressed white apron. She wore a simple, elegant dress the color of pale gold, her dark hair loose around her shoulders for the first time anyone at Ashford Manor had ever seen, and when she reached the end of the aisle, Daniel was waiting for her with an expression that held none of the careful, guarded distance he'd worn for most of his adult life. The guest list looked different too. Ruth the caterer was there, seated in the front rows this time, not working the event. Several of the household staff Maria had once worked quietly alongside were guests now, not employees. Detective Ibarra, who had stayed in touch over the past year out of what had become genuine friendship, sat near the back, smiling through the entire ceremony. Daniel's vows, when it came time for them, weren't polished or rehearsed the way his engagement toast to Vanessa had been a year earlier. They were simple and a little shaky and completely honest. "A year ago," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet garden, "I thought I understood what it meant to be protected. I thought it meant someone who made me look good in front of a crowd. Someone who fit the life I thought I was supposed to have." He paused, glancing toward Maria with an expression so open it made several people in the front row quietly reach for tissues. "I was wrong about almost everything back then. But I wasn't wrong about one thing. Somewhere in this house, hidden in plain sight, wearing a uniform nobody thought to really look at, was the one person who actually saw me. Not my money. Not my name. Just me. And she protected me before I even knew I needed protecting. And she's kept doing it every single day since, in 1,000 small ways that have nothing to do with danger and everything to do with love." Maria's vows were shorter, but no less powerful. "I spent a long time believing that loving someone made you weaker," she said quietly. "That the safest thing I could do was stay invisible, stay guarded, never let anyone close enough to matter. Daniel taught me that was wrong. Being truly seen, not for what I could do, but for who I actually am, turned out to be the strongest thing I've ever felt." She looked at him, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I made a promise to your mother to watch over you. I intend to keep that promise for the rest of my life. Not because I have to anymore. Because I choose to every single day, for as long as you'll have me." There wasn't a dry eye under that white tent. And somewhere, if you believe in such things, Eleanor Ashford was watching too. The promise she'd asked a young trainer to keep all those years ago, having grown into something far larger and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined on that quiet hospital afternoon. So here's what this story really teaches us, friends. Never judge someone by the uniform they wear or the job they hold. The quietest person in the room might be carrying more strength, more history, and more heart than you could ever imagine. Real worth was never about titles, money, or how loud someone speaks. It's about integrity, about who someone chooses to be when nobody's watching, and especially when everybody suddenly is. Maria could have walked away after that slap. She could have quit, found a quieter life, avoided all the chaos that followed. Instead, she stayed true to a promise made to a dying woman. And in doing so, she saved a man's life, exposed a dangerous fraud, and found a love she never thought she deserved. If this story touched your heart even a little tonight, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and reach more people who need stories like this one. If you're new here, please consider subscribing because we bring you a brand new emotional, heartwarming story just like this one very soon. And if you know someone who could use a little reminder tonight that kindness, patience, and quiet strength always win in the end, please share this story with them. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. You're the reason this channel exists. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.